What would you do if your husband kicked you out while you were pregnant only to come begging at your restaurant 24 years later, starving and unrecognizable? Ava Carter had just folded a tiny pair of socks when the words hit her like a thunderclap. I want a divorce. Her hands froze mid-motion, and the baby socks fell to the floor. She looked up at her husband, David Whitmore, confusion clouding her face. What are you saying? David's eyes were cold, distant like he'd already packed up and moved on in his heart. I've met someone else. Someone who understands where I'm headed in life. Someone who fits into the future I'm building. Ava placed a trembling hand on her belly. She was 7 months pregnant with their first child, a boy. David, I'm carrying your son. David looked away. That child will do better without being dragged down by your background. You were a waitress, Ava. An orphan. You can't raise a child who's meant to lead. Ava's knees buckled. She dropped to the floor, grabbing his trouser leg. Please, she whispered. I've stood by you when you had nothing. I believed in you when no one else did. He gently pushed her away, like a burden he was done carrying. Cynthia me assistance, he's educated, refined. She'll give me the kind of children who belong in boardrooms, not food stalls. And just like that, the man Ava had once walked miles with, sharing cold bread and warm dreams, was gone. The same man who once whispered promises under moonlight had become a stranger. He gave her 1 hour to leave. The rain came hard that night in Lagos, like the sky itself mourned her. Ava walked aimlessly, her suitcase dragging behind her, the baby kicking in her womb like he too sensed the storm inside her heart. She had nowhere to go, no parents, no siblings, no money. She was a woman with a swollen belly, soaked clothes, and a heart torn in half. By midnight, her feet could carry her no further. She found shelter in an abandoned concrete building near Oga Junction. The floor was cold and rough. She sat with her back against the wall and wept silently. As dawn broke, casting a pale orange light across the dusty sky, Ava looked down at her belly and whispered, You won't suffer for your father's choices. I promise you that. I will be strong enough for both of us. It wasn't a vow made from confidence. It was made from pure, desperate love. That morning, Ava started knocking on doors, asking for any kind of work. She was turned away over and over again. Some people looked at her swollen belly with pity, others with disgust. A few slammed their doors before she even finished speaking. By sunset, her legs wobbled beneath her. Hunger gnawed at her, but she kept walking. That's when she met Miss Thelma. The older woman sat behind a rickety wooden table piled high with oranges and bananas. Her hands were wrinkled, her eyes kind but sharp. Child, you look like you're about to fall over, Miss Thelma said, narrowing her gaze. Ava opened her mouth, but only air came out. She hadn't eaten in almost 2 days. I'm looking for work, she finally whispered. I can clean. I can sell. I just need a chance. Miss Thelma picked up a banana, peeled it, and handed it to Ava. Eat this before you faint. Ava took the fruit with both hands, like it was a golden treasure. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she ate. You're not the first woman thrown out for being too kind and too poor, Miss Thelma said softly. But if you've got fire in you, I can give you a start. That night, Ava slept on a straw mat behind the fruit stall. It wasn't much, but it was the first safe sleep she'd had in days. For the next 3 months, Ava hawked fruit across the bustling corners of Lagos. Her belly grew heavier, her back ached, but she pushed through. She learned to call out prices with strength, to negotiate with stubborn customers, to smile even when her feet throbbed. Miss Thelma watched her, quietly impressed. One evening, as Ava counted the coins in her apron, Miss Thelma handed her a folded wrapper and said, Come stay in my home. It's small, but you're family now. Ava's lips trembled. Why are you helping me? Miss Thelma's voice cracked with memory. Because no one helped me when I was your age. My husband's family threw me out when I couldn't give them children. I know what it's like to be discarded. That night they ate roasted plantain together under a flickering bulb. 2 women, 1 old, 1 young, both bound by pain, but now tied together by something stronger, compassion. Ava's due date came on a rainy Tuesday night. She went into labor on the floor of Miss Thelma's 1-room home. With no money for a hospital, Miss Thelma boiled water, tore clean sheets, and held Ava's hand as she screamed and pushed. At 2:37 a.m., a baby's cry split through the night. Miss Thelma placed the infant in Ava's arms. "You did it, girl. He's perfect." Tears streamed down Ava's face as she whispered, "Elijah. His name is Elijah." "Why Elijah?" Miss Thelma asked gently. "Because it means, my God is strength. And that's all I've had." From the ashes of betrayal, a mother and son were born together, not just into the world, but into a life that would challenge, test, and ultimately transform them. Ava Carter had been left with nothing, but she was about to build something greater than anyone, especially David Whitmore, could have ever imagined. This was just the beginning. The first night Ava Carter brought Elijah home from the makeshift clinic, there was no crib, no nursery, no baby monitor playing lullabies. There was only a faded mattress in the corner of Miss Thelma's tiny room, the hum of ceiling fans overhead, and the sound of Lagos traffic groaning in the distance. But there was love. So much love. Elijah curled against her chest like he belonged there since before time began, his tiny fists clenching the fabric of her borrowed wrapper. And Ava? She lay there awake, afraid to sleep, not because she was tired, but because she didn't want to miss a single breath. She had lost everything when David Whitmore turned his back on her. But this child, her son, was the beginning of something new, something she would fight for with every breath she had. The next morning, Ava was back at the fruit stall before sunrise. Her body ached from labor, her stitches tugged with each step, and her arms trembled as she carried Elijah in a sling across her chest. Miss Thelma watched silently as Ava set up the table, laying out oranges and bananas as if she hadn't just survived the hardest night of her life. "You should be resting," Miss Thelma said, folding her arms. Ava shook her head, her voice firm despite the exhaustion. "Rest won't feed my child." Miss Thelma smiled, not because she was pleased, but because she recognized that fire. The same fire she once had long ago, before life tried to stamp it out. "All right then, let's make today a good one." For weeks, Ava balanced motherhood with survival. In the mornings, she hawked fruits with Elijah strapped to her back, his soft breathing warm against her spine. In the afternoons, she swept stalls, washed clothes, or offered to clean gutters, whatever earned a few extra naira. By evening, she returned home, feet sore, arms heavy, but still managing a lullaby as she rocked Elijah to sleep on her chest. When customers asked about the baby, Ava simply smiled. "His name is Elijah. He's going to change the world." Most laughed. Some rolled their eyes, but Ava believed it, and she said it often enough that even Miss Thelma started repeating it. Elijah, the boy who was born with nothing but will, do great things. Then came the fever. It started with restlessness. Elijah stopped nursing and whimpered in his sleep. Then the heat came, intense and fast, followed by tremors that shook his tiny body like an earthquake from the inside out. Ava rushed him to the hospital, barely holding herself together as Elijah convulsed in her arms. At Lagos University Teaching Hospital, a doctor emerged with grave eyes. "It's meningitis," he said. "We need to begin treatment immediately, strong antibiotics, monitoring, possibly surgery." Ava's heart dropped. How much? 150,000 naira. She had 75. 75,000 naira she'd saved slowly day by day, hoping to someday use it for Elijah's school fees. And now, it wasn't enough to save his life. Ava sank to her knees in the hospital corridor. I can't lose him, she whispered, rocking back and forth. He's all I have. Miss Thelma, who had rushed over as soon as Ava called, placed a firm hand on her shoulder. Then you won't, the older woman said. Take my savings. All of it. Miss Thelma, no. That boy is my grandson as far as I'm concerned. We'll figure it out. But he's not dying on my watch. Together, their money was just enough to begin treatment. Elijah survived, but Ava was never the same. That night, after Elijah was stabilized and sleeping under soft hospital lights, Ava stood by the window and stared out over Lagos. She could see the rooftops, the flickering signs of night markets, the glow of passing traffic. She clenched her fists and whispered to herself, Never again will I be helpless. I will not beg to save my child. I will create a life so strong, so stable, that nothing and no one can ever take it away again. It wasn't just a vow. It was the moment everything changed. As Elijah recovered, Ava pushed herself harder. She started selling in wealthier areas, closer to offices, banks, and construction sites where workers might have more to spend. She learned which streets were busiest at which times, which fruits sold better depending on the day. She even began waking up before dawn to buy fresher produce, so her table always looked brighter than the rest. Her body was still recovering, her feet still ached, but her mind, sharper than ever. One scorching afternoon, while selling oranges near a construction site in Victoria Island, she overheard a few workers complaining loudly. This food they bring every day is nonsense, one of them grumbled. Tasteless rice, cold meat, and they still charge us like we're dining at some fancy hotel. Ava's ears perked up. Her heart began to race. She wiped her hands on her wrapper, tightened the cloth around Elijah, and stepped forward. Excuse me, sir, she said to the site supervisor, a burly man named Mr. Whitaker. What if I could bring hot, fresh, delicious food tomorrow? I'll feed 50 men. If they don't like it, you don't pay me. He raised an eyebrow. You want to cook for this entire site? I want to cook for hard-working men who deserve to eat well. There was a pause. A long one. Then Mr. Whitaker grunted. One chance. Tomorrow morning, don't disappoint me. That night, Ava stayed up boiling jollof rice, frying plantains, and grilling chicken until the scent filled the entire block. She borrowed pots from neighbors, bartered for seasoning, and poured every ounce of herself into those dishes. The next morning, she arrived before the first crew clocked in. By noon, every grain of rice was gone. Workers licked their fingers. Some asked if she could return every day. Mr. Whitaker handed her a wad of cash and simply said, You're hired. Back at home that evening, Elijah giggled in his makeshift crib. Miss Thelma hugged Ava tightly. You're doing it, child, she said, tears in her eyes. You're turning dust into gold. Ava looked down at her hands rough, tired, and calloused, and smiled. I'm just getting started. The smell of fried plantains drifted through the narrow alley as the sun began to rise over Lagos. On her back, wrapped tightly in a faded cloth, baby Elijah Carter let out a soft gurgle, his version of a morning greeting. Ava Carter smiled, even though her arms ached from carrying pots since dawn. This was their rhythm now. Elijah never left her side. He was there when she bargained for tomatoes, when she stirred giant pots of jollof rice, when she served steaming plates to construction workers on their lunch breaks. While other babies played with toys, Elijah played with spoons and spice packets. And while other mothers had help, cribs and quiet nights, Ava had none of it, just grit, grace, and a determination that burned hotter than any stove she worked over. You're going to be something one day, she whispered into his tiny ear as she secured him to her back. I don't know how yet, but I feel it. Miss Thelma, watching from the doorway, chuckled softly. That boy's first word will be hustle. Ava laughed. Let's just hope it's not pepper. Every day was a test of endurance. Ava would wake before sunrise, prepare meals, carry Elijah, serve food, run errands, and return home long after the streetlights flickered on. She nursed him in quiet corners between deliveries. She changed him under trees when bathrooms weren't an option. She taught him songs in the shade of market stalls. And yet, Elijah thrived. He didn't cry much. He smiled easily. And his eyes, those big, soulful eyes, watched the world with a curiosity far older than his months. He was more than her son. He was her motivation, her reason, her future. As months turned into years, Elijah went from being swaddled to walking beside her, clutching her wrapper as they delivered food trays together. Customers came to expect his shy wave, his giggle, his "thank you, sir," after every sale. At 5 years old, he could count change faster than some grown vendors. At 6, he helped take orders, always polite, always observant. One day a customer teased, "Is this your little accountant?" Ava smiled proudly. "He's the CFO of my kitchen," Miss Thelma added, "and the CEO of my heart." Despite the grind, Ava never forgot what it felt like to be hungry, so she began a quiet habit Elijah noticed early on. Whenever she saw a child begging or a woman sitting alone with tired eyes, she would hand them a meal. No questions, no price. One afternoon, Elijah asked, "Mama, why do we give away food when we could sell it?" Ava knelt beside him and brushed a curl from his forehead. "Because we were once the ones who couldn't pay," she said. "And because success means nothing if it doesn't help someone else rise too." He nodded, absorbing that truth like sunlight. Ava's reputation grew across Lagos. People didn't just come to her for food. They came because the food came with dignity, with warmth. She never cut corners. She never raised her voice. And she never forgot a name. Soon, she had enough to hire 2 more women, both single mothers like her. Then she rented a small kitchen, then a storefront. And finally, after years of saving, she purchased a plot on a busy street in Ikeja and broke ground on her dream. The Golden Pot, a restaurant built from resilience, spices, and second chances. Elijah stood beside her at the opening. Now 10 years old, he wore a too-big dress shirt tucked neatly into his pants. He held her hand as they cut the ribbon, his smile as wide as the Atlantic. "You built this, Mama," he said. Ava shook her head, her voice thick. "No, baby." "We built this." Elijah excelled in school. His teachers praised his curiosity, his discipline, his kindness. He tutored younger students, stayed after class to help clean, and never once used his difficult past as an excuse. But he never forgot their story. He carried it like an invisible backpack, light enough not to weigh him down, but heavy enough to remind him who he was. One Sunday evening, after closing the restaurant, Ava and Miss Thelma sat on the front steps, sipping warm tea. Elijah lay stretched on the tile floor, working on math homework by candlelight. The power had gone out again. Miss Thelma watched him and sighed. "That boy is something else." Ava smiled, eyes full of pride. "I just hope I've given him enough." "You've given him more than most kids with everything," Miss Thelma said firmly. "You've given him purpose." "That's not something money can buy." Later that night, after Elijah had fallen asleep, Ava sat alone at the window, listening to the hum of the city. She thought of David Whitmore, somewhere out there, rich, powerful, and absent. He had missed it all. He had missed Elijah's first step, his first laugh, his first words, his first awards, his first heartbreak. But Ava hadn't missed a thing. She had been there for every scraped knee, every whispered fear, every proud smile. And in that moment, she realized Elijah was never fatherless. He was just raised by someone strong enough to do it all. Ava had started with nothing but pain. Now, she had a son who walked with honor, a restaurant that fed the community, and a name that stood for kindness in a city that too often forgot it. But little did she know, the man who had once abandoned her was about to lose everything, and fate was preparing a reunion no one could have predicted. It began with a restless night. Elijah was just over 1 year old, still wobbling when he walked, still clutching Ava's fingers like he held the whole world in his grip. That evening, he hadn't eaten much. By midnight, he was warm to the touch. By 2 a.m., his body burned like a furnace. Ava pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, whispering lullabies that sounded more like prayers, but the fever didn't break. Instead, Elijah began to convulse. His small body shook violently in her arms, his eyes rolled back. His lips turned pale. Ava screamed. They raced through the sleeping streets of Lagos, wrapped in night and panic. Miss Thelma flagged down an old taxi and held Elijah tight, while Ava cried in the backseat, whispering, "Stay with me, baby. Stay with me." At Lagos University Teaching Hospital, the fluorescent lights felt cold and unforgiving. A nurse took Elijah from her trembling arms. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then the doctor came. "It's meningitis," he said gravely. "We need to begin treatment immediately. Antibiotics, constant monitoring, possibly surgery." Ava's heart dropped. "How much?" 150,000 naira. She had 75,000 naira she'd spent years saving for Elijah's education, for their future. And it wasn't enough to save him now. She collapsed in the hallway, knees hitting tile, fingers clawing at the floor, like she could dig her way out of despair. "I can't lose him," she sobbed. Miss Thelma knelt beside her, placing both hands on her shoulders. Her voice was firm, not shaky. "Then we won't. Take my savings. Every kobo." "No," Ava whispered, shaking her head. "You need that. You worked your whole life. And I've lived that life. That boy is my family, and family saves each other." Their combined money scraped together just enough to begin treatment, and by some grace, Elijah survived. But something in Ava died that night, and something else was born. She sat by Elijah's bedside for days, holding his hand as machines beeped and IVs dripped into his tiny arm. His curls were matted with sweat. His breaths came shallow, but she watched each one like it was a miracle. On the third night, when he finally opened his eyes and blinked at her, she smiled through tears and whispered, "You're not going to just survive, Elijah. You're going to thrive." Then she turned toward the window, where the city lights shimmered through the glass, and made herself a vow. "Never again will I beg to save my child. Never again will I watch him suffer because I didn't have enough. From this moment on, I will change everything." When Elijah was discharged, Ava returned to work before her hands fully stopped shaking. She hawked food with new fire. She worked longer hours, pushing past fatigue, whispering to herself during each sale, "For Elijah. For the future." She didn't rest. She didn't complain. She just moved faster, sharper, smarter. She began watching how businesses operated, not just cooking, but studying. She noticed which dishes sold quickest, which areas drew the most workers, which times yielded the best sales, and she wrote everything down. In a small dog-eared notebook, she began to outline her plan. Miss Thelma noticed the change. "You don't blink anymore," she said one evening as they shared tea. "You move like someone chasing fire." "I am," Ava replied. "I'm chasing a life that doesn't make me beg for mercy." The old woman smiled. "Then make sure that fire doesn't burn you too." Soon, Ava began experimenting with new recipes. She tested seasonings on Miss Thelma and Elijah, asking, "Too spicy? Too dry? Enough salt?" At the market, she negotiated like a lioness, fierce, direct, unapologetic. She cooked in borrowed kitchens, on borrowed time, waking before the sun and falling asleep beside her son, with her apron still tied around her waist. Elijah, now stronger and more playful, began walking confidently by her side, mimicking her sales calls. Hot rice, sweet plantain, tasty chicken, mama's best. Customers loved him. They started calling him Little Boss. But behind the smiles, Ava never forgot that night at the hospital. The helplessness, the fear, the shame of not being able to save her own child without help. She carried that memory like armor, not as a wound, but as fuel. Each time she served a plate of food, she served it with pride, not pity. Each time she handed free meals to hungry children, she did it without hesitation. And each night, after Elijah fell asleep, she'd open that notebook and write more of her plan. Rent a kitchen, expand delivery zones, create a name, customers remember, hire other single mothers, buy land, build a real restaurant, one step at a time. On Elijah's second birthday, Ava didn't have money for a party, but she had a clean shirt for him, a new book, and a small cake made with leftover flour and honey. He clapped his hands and squealed with joy. And as they sang under the soft glow of a single candle, Ava looked around the room, at Elijah's smile, at Miss Thelma's proud eyes, at the cracked walls that somehow held more love than any mansion, and whispered again, "We're going to make it. I swear to you, we will." That was the day Ava stopped surviving and started building. The fever had nearly stolen her son. But in its aftermath, it gave her something just as powerful. Clarity. She knew who she was now. A mother. A warrior. A woman who had once been discarded, but who would never be powerless again. The morning was already blistering when Ava Carter arrived at the Victoria Island construction site with a wheelbarrow full of steaming pots. Inside them, spicy jollof rice, sweet fried plantains, grilled chicken with smoky skin, and a pepper sauce that could make a grown man cry with joy. This was her first big order. 50 meals, all made the night before in a borrowed kitchen, with ingredients bought on trust and borrowed money. She hadn't slept, not even a minute. But her spirit, wide awake. Workers began lining up, drawn in by the scent and the sight of the woman standing proudly behind her makeshift serving station. "You're the one the supervisor mentioned?" one asked, half skeptical. Ava smiled, tying her headscarf tighter. "Taste the food. Then ask your questions." They tasted, and then they devoured. Within 30 minutes, every plate was scraped clean. Men licked their fingers. Some asked for seconds. One worker even returned just to hug her. "You're feeding us like our mothers used to," he said. Ava nearly cried. From that day on, she was invited back. Again and again. Word spread fast across scaffolds and office corridors, across dusty roads and crowded markets. The woman with the golden rice. The food that tasted like home. Soon, Ava had contracts with 3 construction sites, then 5. She began waking at 4 a.m., cooking in bulk, organizing deliveries. With the help of Miss Thelma and 2 other women, both single mothers, she trained herself. Ava was no longer just cooking. She was running a business. At first, she delivered food in plastic trays and balanced pots on wooden carts. But soon, she saved enough to rent a proper kitchen teeny, but hers. She painted the walls sunshine yellow, hung a chalkboard menu, and scribbled on the door in bright white letters, "Ava's Golden Pot, meals made with heart." It was the first time her name had ever been on a building. She stood back and stared at it for a long time, not because she was proud though she was, but because no one had ever given her anything permanent before. Now, she was giving it to herself. Elijah, now 6, watched all of it with wide eyes. Every afternoon after school, he'd rush to the kitchen, put on his too big apron, and help however he could. He swept the floor. He dried dishes. He counted change. And every time Ava caught him watching her with that quiet admiration, she'd smile and say, "This is ours, baby. Not just mine. You've been with me every step." He'd nod solemnly, as if he already knew. Because he did. One afternoon, a customer asked her, "Why don't you open a restaurant?" Ava paused. A restaurant? She'd never dared say it out loud, not because she didn't want one, but because for so long it had felt impossible. She looked down at her hands rough from cooking, scarred from struggle, and whispered, "One day, I'll build a place with real tables, real windows, and enough warmth to feed the whole city." That night, she opened her notebook and flipped to a blank page. At the top, she wrote, "The Real Golden Pot, My Future Restaurant." And below that, she made a list. Buy a small plot of land. Apply for food permits. Design a simple dining area. Train more women. Create a menu that honors my journey. It wasn't just a dream now. It was a plan. Miss Thelma looked over her shoulder as she wrote, "You really think Lagos is ready for a restaurant like that?" Ava smiled. They better be. Because she had already survived what they said she couldn't. And now, she wasn't just surviving. She was rising. The scent of simmering stew filled the kitchen as Elijah Carter, now 10 years old, carefully sliced tomatoes under his mother's watchful eye. "Not too thin," Ava said gently, wiping her hands on her apron. "We don't want them to vanish in the pot." "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied with a grin. He loved moments like these, not because he wanted to be a chef, but because he loved watching his mother turn simple things into something magical. Elijah had grown up in a world filled with noise pots clanging, customers laughing, fire crackling beneath heavy pots. But in that chaos, he found rhythm. At school, he was always the one who raised his hand first, not to show off, but because he wanted to understand everything. His teachers called him a quiet storm. He listened more than he spoke. He read during lunch. And when classmates teased him for being the rice lady's son, he'd smile and say, "At least my mom's food makes people happy." At night, Ava would sit beside him, helping with homework, even when her back ached and her eyes begged for sleep. When she didn't know the answers, she found someone who did. "Smart isn't about knowing everything," she told him. "It's about never being afraid to learn." And Elijah took that to heart. By the time he was 12, he had won a scholarship to one of Lagos's top private schools. The day the acceptance letter came, Ava sat in stunned silence for almost a full minute. Then she laughed, cried, and danced all at once. "You see," she said, hugging him tight, "you were meant for more. And I'm going to make sure you get it." She worked double shifts, cut every extra cost, and saved every spare coin to buy his uniforms, books, and bus fare. No sacrifice felt too big. Because this wasn't just about education, it was about breaking the cycle. At his new school, Elijah faced a different kind of challenge. He was surrounded by children from powerful families, sons of lawyers, daughters of politicians, kids who traveled abroad during holidays. At first, he felt like an outsider. But when he started getting top marks in math, something shifted. Classmates began asking for help. Even teachers pulled him aside to praise his essays. Elijah never bragged. He never acted like he was better. He just showed up every day with grace, focus, and a quiet confidence that grew with him. Back at home, he still helped in the restaurant. He still dried dishes, still took orders. Still brought his mom a cold drink after a long day. "Why don't you rest, Elijah?" Ava would ask, and he'd say, "Because this place raised me too." "I'm not above it, I'm part of it." Miss Thelma, now in her early 70s, loved telling customers stories of Elijah's childhood. "How many boys you know can count change at age 5 or read the newspaper before breakfast?" Customers laughed. Some didn't believe her, but the truth was, Elijah was special, not because he was the smartest, but because he never took anything for granted. One Sunday after dinner, Elijah asked, "Mama, do you ever regret not going to school?" Ava thought for a moment. "I don't regret my life," she said, "because it gave me you. But if I had been educated, maybe I would have known how to dream bigger, sooner." Then she touched his face gently. "But you, Elijah, you're my second chance to dream out loud." By 17, he was the top student in his class. By 18, he received a full university scholarship to study engineering. And at his graduation, Ava sat in the front row, holding back tears as her son stepped onto the stage. He held his diploma with both hands and looked straight at her. "This is for you, Mama." Back at the restaurant that evening, Miss Thelma raised a toast with a glass of malt. "To the boy who grew up in a kitchen," she said, "but never forgot to look up." Everyone clapped. Some cried. And Ava? She just smiled, heart full. Because she hadn't just raised a son, she had raised a good man. At the peak of his career, David Whitmore believed he had it all. The expensive suits, the corner office, the flashy car. The wife on his arm, Vanessa Blake, elegant, polished, and the very definition of success in Lagos society. No one remembered the poor junior banker who once ate street food and walked home through dust. He had erased that man, buried him beneath power, pride, and polished shoes, and with him he had buried Ava Carter and the unborn son he had never met. David's marriage to Vanessa was everything he'd imagined. Lavish parties, social circles filled with the elite, vacations in Dubai, meetings in London, dinners with oil executives. But Vanessa, she was no fool. She hadn't married David for love. She had married him for leverage, and the moment she found someone more valuable, Chief Adabio, an oil tycoon worth billions, she began to plan her exit. At first, the signs were subtle. Late nights she didn't explain, calls she wouldn't take around him, a coldness in bed that felt too familiar. But David, consumed by his ambition, didn't question it. He thought her silence meant respect. What he didn't know was that Vanessa had been gathering evidence for months. Bank statements, transactions, all the little shortcuts David had taken over the years to maintain their luxurious lifestyle, unreported bonuses, misallocated company funds, offshore transfers. Vanessa made copies of everything. And then, in one perfectly timed move, she reported him to the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission and disappeared. The EFCC raid happened on a Monday morning. David had just arrived at work, coffee in hand, when agents stormed the office. They arrested him in front of everyone, his assistants, his junior staff, even the janitor who had once looked up to him. The humiliation was complete. The evidence? Overwhelming. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Vanessa was never seen again. She had vanished, along with every last naira in their joint accounts. Inside Kirikiri prison, the walls were narrow and the air heavy with sweat and regret. David, who once dined on rooftop restaurants, now slept on a concrete slab beside rats and roaches. He had time to think. Too much time. Time to remember how it all started, how Ava used to wait up for him, even when he worked late. How she believed in him when no one else did. How she had begged him to stay for the sake of their unborn child. He had ignored her, discarded her. Now, he was the one discarded, forgotten by colleagues, abandoned by his so-called friends, and invisible to the world. One night, in the pitch-dark cell, David whispered to the ceiling, "I gave up everything real, for nothing." And for once, there was no voice to argue with him, not even his own. When he was finally released, David was 51, but looked 70. His hair was grey, his back hunched. His hands shook from years of stress and sleepless nights. He had no home, no money, no job, and worse, a criminal record that made him untouchable in every corporate circle he once ruled. He spent his nights on the streets of Lagos Island, curled under awnings, begging for change. Strangers walked past him like he didn't exist, and in a cruel twist of fate, He passed by food stalls selling the same kind of jollof rice he once mocked Ava for cooking. But now, he couldn't even afford a spoonful. One afternoon, sitting against a building wall with an empty cup in hand, David watched the world move on without him. He was invisible. But fate hadn't finished with him yet, because just a few blocks away, a young mantle, poised, with familiar eyes and a quiet confidence, was about to cross his path. And in that moment, the life David tried to erase would come back, face to face. It was a sweltering Thursday afternoon when Elijah Carter stepped out of his office. Now 24, dressed in a crisp white shirt and fitted navy slacks, Elijah was a picture of quiet success. Fresh out of university, with first-class honors in engineering, he had just landed a coveted job at one of Lagos's top consulting firms. To anyone passing by, he looked like a man with the world at his feet. But Elijah never let that go to his head. He remembered where he came from. He remembered helping his mother carry trays of rice, mopping restaurant floors before school, and studying by candlelight while she whispered encouragement. He knew every inch of struggle and every ounce of love that had built him. As he crossed a busy street corner, something caught his eye. A man, slumped against a building wall. Skin leathery from the sun, clothes torn, eyes vacant. There were many like him in Lagos, men forgotten by time, chewed up by the city and spit out. But this one, something about the way he sat, shoulders curled inward like a broken question mark, stirred something in Elijah. He slowed, then stopped. "Sir," Elijah said gently, "are you hungry?" The man looked up, eyes dull with exhaustion. But behind the clouded gaze, something flickered, a trace of recognition, though Elijah couldn't place it. "Please," the man croaked. "Anything you can spare." Elijah nodded. "Come with me. Let me get you a real meal." They walked in silence. Elijah guided the man down the street, unaware that with every step he was walking closer to a past he never knew. When they reached the Golden Pot, Elijah pushed open the door. The familiar smell of grilled chicken, fried plantains, and spices wrapped around them like a warm hug. From behind the counter, Ava Carter looked up and froze, her breath caught. Her body stiffened, time blurred, because standing beside her grown son was the man who had once thrown her out onto the street, pregnant and alone. David Whitmore. She didn't speak, didn't move. Just stared. Elijah noticed. "Mama." "You okay?" Her lips parted. Then, barely a whisper. "David." Elijah's eyes widened. He turned to the man beside him. Really looked this time. Same jawline, same nose. No, it couldn't be. "Wait, you," Elijah's voice cracked. "You're my father." David stepped back, eyes glassy. "Elijah, don't call me that." The words hit like thunder. Ava stepped around the counter. "Son, you threw us away," Elijah said, voice rising. "You left my mother on the street like trash. She built everything without you. And now you show up looking for a free meal?" David shook his head. "I didn't know. I was stupid. I thought—" "You thought money was more important than people." Elijah's fists clenched, his chest heaved. Then he turned and stormed out. David collapsed into a nearby chair, head in his hands. Ava walked over slowly, setting a plate of food on the table. He didn't touch it. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Ava. I gave up everything real for things that meant nothing." Ava sat beside him, eyes soft but steady. "I forgave you years ago," she said. "Not for your sake, for mine. Carrying hate would have poisoned everything I tried to build." David looked at her worn, wiser, radiant in her quiet strength. "You raised a good man," he said. "I didn't raise him to hate you," she replied. "But I didn't lie to him either. I told him you made a choice, and that he could choose differently." That night, Back at home, Ava and Miss Thelma sat Elijah down. He sat stiffly on the couch, arms folded, eyes still blazing.
"Anger is a heavy burden," Ava said softly. "And I know it well. But holding on to it will only harden you. He doesn't deserve forgiveness, Mama."
"No," Miss Thelma added, "but you deserve peace." Elijah didn't answer. But something in him cracked just a little, and for the first time since that afternoon, he felt the storm inside begin to settle. The next few days were quiet in the Carter household. Too quiet. Elijah barely spoke. He went to work, ate dinner in silence, avoided his mother's eyes, but Ava knew. She recognized the storm behind his stillness, the same storm she had once carried inside her after David left. And just like her, Elijah was drowning in questions he didn't ask out loud. Why wasn't I enough for him to stay? Would he have come back if he hadn't hit rock bottom? Does forgiving him make me weak? He had worked so hard to become a man with no holes inside. But now, one had opened up and it wouldn't stop bleeding. One evening, Miss Thelma knocked on his bedroom door. She didn't wait for a reply. She just came in, holding a mug of warm cocoa like it was a peace offering. "You're angry," she said. He nodded. "You have every right to be," she added. "But let me ask you something, Elijah. How long do you plan to carry a man who couldn't carry you?" Elijah looked up, eyes narrowed. Miss Thelma sat down beside him, her voice softer now. "I've learned this the hard way. Forgiveness isn't for the other person. It's for the one who wants to sleep at night." That night, Elijah stared at the ceiling long after the lights went out. He thought about every time his mother had come home sore and tired, but still smiled. He thought about the way she had spoken about David not with hatred, but with clarity. She never let his choices shape her soul, Elijah murmured to himself. And maybe that's why she still laughed. Why she still loved. Why she could sit across from the man who broke her and offer him a warm plate of food. Because she had made peace her priority. On the third morning, Elijah returned to the same street corner where he had first seen David. And there he was, still sitting, hunched and smaller than Elijah remembered. Like life itself had folded him in half. David looked up. For a moment he seemed unsure whether to speak. Then Elijah sat beside him. No words at first, just two men, one filled with shame, the other wrestling with legacy. Then Elijah finally said, "I've decided to forgive you." David blinked, stunned. "Does that mean?" "It means," Elijah interrupted, "that I won't let your choices keep shaping mine." He pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to him. "This is a rehab center. They help former inmates rebuild their lives. If you're serious about change, start there." David's hand trembled as he took the card. "Thank you, son." Elijah stood up. "I'm not doing this for you." David nodded slowly. "I know." And somehow, that honesty made it more real. Elijah walked away with his shoulders lighter. Not because the past had disappeared, but because he had stopped dragging it into every room he entered. He had made a choice, to live forward, not backward. Back at home that evening, Ava waited at the dining table with 2 bowls of egusi soup and a quiet smile. "Did you go see him?" she asked. Elijah nodded. "I forgave him," he said, "not because he earned it, but because I refused to stay angry for another 24 years. Ava reached for his hand across the table. "My son," she whispered, "that's what strength really looks like." Years would pass, and the pain would fade, but never fully disappear. David would enter the rehab program, find steady work as a security guard, and live simply. He would send Elijah occasional letters, never asking for a relationship, only sharing glimpses of his progress, and that was enough. Because not every story needs a perfect ending to be whole. Sometimes, The healing lies in the choice to stop bleeding even if the scar remains. 5 years later, the golden pot was packed on a warm Sunday afternoon. Laughter echoed from corner to corner. Plates of steaming jollof rice, grilled fish, and pepper soup moved across tables like offerings of joy. And at the center of it all sat Ava Carter, radiant in a yellow dress, silver now streaking through her curls. To her right, Elijah Carter held his 2-year-old daughter on his lap, while his wife, Adai, wiped sauce from the baby's chin. Miss Thelma, now in her 80s, commanded a small audience of children at a nearby table, telling stories of the early days, when the restaurant was just a tray and a dream. It was loud, chaotic, beautiful, a family built not by perfection, but by persistence. The restaurant had grown into 3 locations across Lagos. Ava had trained dozens of women single mothers, widows, women like herself, and helped them open their own food stalls. She had become something she never imagined in her youth. A community leader, a mentor, a symbol of what could rise from dust and heartbreak. People no longer whispered about the woman who was once left pregnant in the street. Now, they spoke her name with respect. Ava Carter. Businesswoman, mother, survivor. But one person wasn't at the table. David Whitmore. After completing the rehabilitation program Elijah had connected him with, David had found a modest job as a night security guard at a small warehouse. He lived quietly, in a rented room above a mechanic shop. He never asked for anything, never begged to be let back in. But every few months, he wrote Elijah a letter. Short, handwritten, never emotional. Always polite, updates on work, health. A book he had read. Sometimes Elijah wrote back, sometimes he didn't. And that was okay, because some wounds don't need to be reopened to heal. They just need space. One letter. Elijah kept tucked inside his briefcase. It simply read, "I don't expect to be called your father. I just hope you know I think about you every day and that I'm proud of the man you've become." David. Elijah had never shown the letter to anyone, but on the nights he felt uncertain, overwhelmed by work or fatherhood or the weight of being the one who made it, he'd pull it out and read it in silence. It didn't erase the past, but it reminded him that even broken men could try to build again. Back at the restaurant, Ava watched Elijah bounce his daughter on his knee. Her heart swelled. He was kind, gentle, driven. But more than anything, he had learned how to love without fear and how to let go without losing his soul. She reached over and touched his hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" He smiled. "For proving that we didn't need a perfect story to have a beautiful one." Outside, Lagos buzzed with its usual rhythm cars honking, vendors shouting, music spilling from shops. But inside the golden pot, it felt like the world had paused, just long enough for this family born of pain, raised on hope, to breathe, laugh, and be whole. Not in the way fairy tales promise, but in the way real life allows, messy, mended, meaningful. Because at the end of the day, the greatest gift Ava had ever given Elijah wasn't food, or shelter, or even school. It was the lesson that carried them through every storm. True strength isn't found in what you escape from, but in what you choose to build anyway. And build they did. Together, life doesn't always give us fairness, but it offers us chances to rise. This story reminds us that the strength of a mother's love can build an entire life from the rubble of betrayal. Ava Carter was abandoned, humiliated, and left with nothing, but she chose not to let bitterness define her. Instead, she poured every ounce of her strength into raising her son with dignity, kindness, and purpose. Her journey teaches us that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's freedom. When Elijah chose to forgive the father who abandoned him, it wasn't about excusing the past. It was about refusing to carry its weight into his future. For those of us in our later years, this story gently asks, what are we still holding on to? And is it helping you or holding us back? We may not be able to rewrite our beginnings, but we can choose how we live the rest of our story with grace, generosity, and the courage to let go. Because sometimes the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't what we've earned, but who we've become in the process. Hoi ChatGPT.